And
Yeah.
you show some examples, I think in the first chapter, taking advantage of the different reading traditions of the Quran, and we'll return to this. But the dominant reading tradition is Hafs and Asim, which is 95% of current, let's say, editions of the Quran, or at least publications of the Quran, follow that. But then there's the Warsh tradition, which I don't know if I can put you on the spot and show how some of the difference between Warsh and Hafs actually, prove your point.
Yeah. No, sure. So what's kind of interesting, what happens with these things is okay, people establish, yes, it's a language of poetry, and there something gets stuck in. It's like, okay, well, one step is saying it's a language of poetry. The language of poetry is possibly quite broad, but then they kind of implicitly assume that the language of poetry is identical to the classical Arabic as we know it from our textbooks today. Right. And I kind of use this term, which is not always happy, the textbook classical Arabic, that is classical Arabic that you'll find in Wright or Fisher, right? And using that term kind of gives the idea that textbook classical Arabic only gets established by Orientalists in the 19th century. It's certainly earlier than that a real standard develops. So don't take that away from it. But it's not clear that this very strict standard already existed in this early Islamic period. So at the time that the canonical readers are alive, so Hafs dies like 180 or something like that. Warsh is 190 Hijri, I should add. Are these readers doing just normal classical Arabic? Because that seems to be an implicit assumption. So I have this quote in my book from Hans Weer, the dictionary Hans Weer, who is saying, the Quran is written in the dialect of the Hijaz. We didn't have Hamzas, but of course he just pronounced them. It's like, really? And he cites words. He cites mu'min, he cites mu'min, right, the believer. He cites bi'r, and he cites na'im. It's like all three of those are actually pronounced in the Quranic reading traditions as bir, mu'min, and na'im.
And na'im. Yes.
So that's a very strange, that's a terrible example to use.
Could you give the translations of those terms, Marijn? Sorry.
Believer, well, and sleeping, I guess. So there are two pronunciations, and those are both Quran, and they're considered completely valid and canonical Quran. And you see that there's this real, a real tradition of opining on the language of the Quran, and until as late as 2020, where people say, well, the language of the Quran doesn't have imala. So the language of the Quran doesn't have imala? That's a crazy thing to say. A word like bana, he built, is read by 4 of the 10 canonical readers as baneh. That's not, there is imala. So
imala is an inclination of the sound towards an E sound, basically.
So it's a being pronounced as a. And so people are just opining about what the language of the Quran is, what tajweed of the Quran is, without ever actually checking, which I don't know. It's just, going through this research, many times it's like, am I the one going crazy? Am I missing something here? It's like, why are they even making this claim? What are they basing it on? And in the end, I have to conclude that, it has to be something in terms of, just Hafs-Normativity. They just open up the Hafs Quran and it's like, well, this is Quran, and there's nothing else, and there is something else, and there, many other traditions. Yeah.
So just to clarify this a bit more, going back to the example of mu'min, bi'r, and na'im, these are written without the hamza in the standard Quran that we know from Hafs, but in Warsh, is it different?
Yeah. So na'im isn't na'im. You only get it in a very specific pronunciation, very specific context within the reading tradition of Hamza. But the other two, so mu'min and bi'r, are just recited as mu'min and bi'r in the reading of Warsh. So, and not just the reading of Warsh, by the way.
Yeah, and so your point is, does that mean somehow Warsh is not in the poetic or something, or is not Arabiya if we have these differences? Okay.
Right, and if that's the case, you can't say that the Quran is classical Arabic or is the poetic koine and say this is not classical Arabic or not the poetic koine, and at the same time have reading traditions which are considered equally valid
Yes.
Well, at least you first have to explain why you're dismissing those. And the answer cannot be because I conveniently had a Hafs Quran here, right? The
Yes.
explanation needs to be there
Yes.
are valid reasons why you have to dismiss it. I haven't found a valid reason to dismiss these.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and maybe a good time. I forget if you cited the term as well, but Suhaib Saeed likes to speak about Hafs-Normativity. And just a reminder that, I mean, it's at least from a confessional point of view, standard Islamic teaching is that there are 7 or maybe 10 or maybe more standard ways of reading the text, and there are 2 receptions of each way of reading the text. But I mean, at least following from Ibn Mujahid, these are all sort of acceptable, right? There's not the fact that Hafs has sort of won the day in the subsequent transmission of the text doesn't mean that it's the only acceptable reading. Does that sound okay?
And to add to that, I mean, it's a very recent dominance. Like Hafs really, like, okay, so nobody's doing the research, and I have a research proposal which I'll hopefully get funding for to figure this out. But nobody has actually looked when does Hafs actually become dominant and where. But if you go to 13th, 14th century Qurans, Hafs is very difficult to find. It's around 16th, 17th century that you see a shift.
Okay, interesting.
So it's a really recent development that Hafs has such a dominant position, and Warsh even today is the dominant reading tradition in North Africa.
North Africa.
So yeah.